My name is Lawrie. I'm privileged to be the Chief Executive of StreetGames. I've been around the organisation since we set up about nearly 16 years ago now. I was just telling someone at lunchtime, when StreetGames started, we started in a builder's office in Stockport with 4 of us because we had to borrow an office. So life has changed quite a lot in that time. But really pleased to be here this afternoon, and we've got a great panel of speakers that are going to share some insights with you, particularly linked to the whole area of communities. So if you think you're here for children and young people in schools, you're in the wrong room. But we will make our presentations. We want to try and keep it informal because you've all just had a large lunch, so we don't want people nodding off. So if you do have questions or comments as we go through, please share them, and I'll introduce fellow speakers as they come up. So I'm just going to talk first of all a little bit about this whole idea about thriving active communities and how sport and physical activity can actually make a difference to both individual and community well-being in a post-COVID world. And I used the word thriving, and I looked at it this morning and I thought, what does that actually mean? We use the word thriving a lot. And when I looked it up, it talks about prosperous, growing, flourishing, a pleasant and enjoyable place to be. And I think a lot of the time when we think about the communities that we work in, and many of you will work in, those aren't the words that necessarily come to mind. But I think those are the words that any one of us would want for our community. We'd all want to live in a place that is thriving, that is an enjoyable and pleasant place to live. And though for many people with the 24-hour news culture that we have, COVID is firmly in the rearview mirror, and for some people has disappeared round the bend because they can't even remember. But if you think about 3.5 years ago, we actually learned a new language. Who'd ever heard the word furloughed before? I went to work, as many others did, in my tracksuit bottoms. One of the huge conversation points of the day was about these, which is not something I ever expected to spend my professional life talking about. And we had this strange situation where we were only able to go out initially for 30 minutes a day. And of course, and we're still partly in this hybrid world of working, the difference between having your camera on or off. But as the Joseph Rowntree Foundation said, with COVID we were all on the same sea, but we definitely weren't in the same boat. And whilst in more middle class areas we had mutual aid, we had communities coming together to do each other's shopping, if you went into the most deprived communities around the UK, the death rate from COVID is double what it was in the most affluent areas. And if you think about what that means from a lived experience point of view, that means if you live in a deprived community, you were twice as likely to know someone who died from COVID. And many of you who work for organisations who support these communities will know that young people in those communities would have had multiple family members in some cases who actually died from COVID. And during the pandemic, it was a harsher impact in low-income areas. So whilst most of us, many of us sat at our laptops doing Teams calls, Zoom calls, finding out what those meant, nearly a third of the people who were the lowest paid employees were either furloughed or lost their jobs, as opposed to 1 in 10 of the top earners. And since then, this isn't great after lunch material, I realise. Since then, it hasn't got any better in some cases. So these are some of what my colleague the other week described as the misery statistics, but actually these are really stark. So we've got 125,000 children and young people have not gone back to school since the COVID pandemic. 1.7 million children have got attendance at school of less than 90%. Somebody made that point in the previous workshop about one of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs at the bottom level for teenagers being Wi-Fi. Yes, absolutely it is, but From a Maslow perspective, you've got families where they are and will be, as we come into the colder months, choosing between putting their heating on and heating up their food. And it's not one or two. This is millions and millions of families and young people that are going through this. And it was interesting when we did the skills session earlier that whilst 50% of the population of young people do go to university in this country, which is great, I was the first person in my family to get the chance to go to university, growing up in a council house, that kind of social mobility bit that I was a fortunate recipient of. Of the 50% that don't go to university at 18, 3 in 5 of them are not in education, employment or training. The public sector and the NHS are under huge financial and workforce strain. We've talked about the pressures on leisure providers and the workforce shortages, skills and the issues. And there's a catalogue of other things that I could put on this slide. We recently went to some of the party conferences, and Bernardo's published a report on the first day of Tory Party conference where they said that there are 1 million children in the UK who do not have their own bed. They either sleep on the floor or they share a bed with a sibling or somebody else. Now that, for me, is one of the ultimate statistics, because you just imagine either your own children or your nieces or nephews or your grandchildren. Imagine them sleeping in a house in a community where they don't have a bed. And Demos talked about poverty has become the wallpaper that, if we were to resolve it, would reduce the demand on our public services. But it's so omnipresent, it's everywhere, that it's almost ignored now. When I think about COVID, one of the brilliant things that happened with Marcus Rashford with his campaign for children to have proper holiday provision, suddenly the whole country, no matter where you were, was aware of the fact that there are many, many children, young people and families living in poverty in this country. And what that means for sport is, as you heard this morning from Nick when he spoke, Nick Pontefract, it means you're less likely to play. It means you're less likely to be involved in a club. If you're 10% likely to be active as a child or young person from the lowest income family when you're under 16, you're 20% less likely by the time you're over 16. So inactive children and young people from poor backgrounds and deprived communities lead to even more inactive adults. However, before we go too far down the road of misery, there is a positive policy landscape right now for trying to address these things and for making a real difference in communities. And whilst Get Active is not perfect, and it's yet another government sports strategy, what it does do is it actually, for once, it sets targets about 1 million more children and young people active by 2030. 1.4 million more adults from lower socioeconomic groups active by 2030. For me, what's most important within it isn't that bit, actually. It's the commitment to recognising that sport has a role to play in our well-being, from a physical well-being, from a mental well-being, from a social and community development well-being perspective. Those 5 outcomes that were in Sporting Future in 2015 have stayed. And above all else, from my perspective, that's the bit that really makes the difference for our communities. You heard from Kim this morning. Who enjoyed Kim's speech this morning? Have a show of hands. Isn't she brilliant? She chaired our fringe at Labour Party conference, and it was hilarious because there were police and crime commissioners and people in the room. And she was like, so what are you going to do? And what are you going to do? And she's priceless. But from a policy perspective, this Healthy Britain paper is really, really good for sport and physical activity. It talks about the way that we should be integrating ourselves within the wider world of well-being, and I know that colleagues who will speak after me will have more knowledge and more to say about that. And then the third thing from a policy point of view, I would encourage you to get one of these online. I know the slides will be shared. This, for me, which was launched by Demos back in April, gives me real hope that actually things can look different over time. And what this actually talks about is the preventative state. So you heard people earlier talking about prevention and early intervention, but part of the preventative state, what this policy briefing contends, is that we've lost sight of some of the foundations that provide prevention in our communities. So as that top quote says, we're stuck in what they call a doom loop of trying to fix ever greater problems without actually tackling the underlying causes and strengthening social capital and volunteering in our neighbourhoods to prevent them. When you looked at that previous data around volunteering, the lowest levels of volunteering in the poorest areas, the greatest need for civic institutions and places to go are in the poorest areas. And this pamphlet, which I think Labour are taking a very serious look at, talks about the importance of community organisations, community institutions, be they sports clubs, be they arts organisations, be they leisure providers, be they youth community organisations, because those are the organisations that we want to shape our lives. We don't want our lives to be shaped by statutory services. We don't want to be talking to education psychologists about our children unless they've got really acute needs. We want them to be enjoying fun, enjoyable activity in community organisations. And what this says is that prevention shouldn't be focused on public services. So our big statutory services, children's services, adult social care, all of those things are necessary. We're never going to not need them. But actually, people should be living their lives in their communities, enjoying their lives in their communities, and community strength can rebalance the demand. Because otherwise, all that's going to happen is we're going to put more and more and more demand on our public services and they will crack. There's already signs of that happening now. So this, if you look it up, gives me a great deal of hope if it becomes the basis for future strategy. And that whole area of community strength came out of a piece of work that we were really fortunate to be the secretariat for with some celebs. So Adrian Childs, those of you who know Adrian, who's obviously a Five Live journalist and general man about the telly and radio. Charlie Webster, who's an absolutely fantastic campaigner and journalist, very, very focused on issues around some of the challenges of domestic abuse. And Brendan Batson, OBE, who's just published his book. I'm not getting any royalties, but it's called The Third Degree, which I think is a brilliant title. And they came together to work on the Charles Webster Batson Commission, and what they did was they looked at the importance of community organisations in the poorest areas around the UK, not just in England, right across England, Wales and Scotland. And what they found won't surprise anybody. But I feel like a little bit like we're stuck in a loop. Like, we know young people don't have the best access to sport and the offerings of sport, and we know that cost is a barrier. We know that what's there is very much a patchwork in terms of what's available for them, and it is. To talk about a postcode lottery, it's absolutely a postcode lottery about whether you've got a great youth and community organisation in your neighbourhood or whether you haven't. And that's the difference often about whether or not you're active outside school. So I'm not going to run through all of these except to say that what the Commission found was that the community organisations are more effective than any other type in reaching young people who might be considered the most vulnerable. Again, that won't surprise you, but it's probably the first time I've seen it written down like that. And what the Commission put forward as its headlines was to try and do more to recognise the role of these locally trusted community organisations, not members of the StreetGames network, each of those individual organisations, regardless of what they are and what their overall purpose is, their value in their neighbourhoods and the fact that they need to be funded for the long term. Somebody said this morning, 6 months of funding doesn't work. I think it was Nick again, actually. These organisations, if they are to be the community institutions that are going to provide the prevention that we need in our communities, need that funding for the long term. And we need to be really ambitious for them. We need to be really aware that they do play a role in tackling some of the risk factors around obesity certainly play a role in improving mental health. In the current government's policy perspective, they can play a role in levelling up. But often they're the last thought. And as Kim said this morning, at the moment, in some cases, the voluntary sector is propping up the fact that our public services are not doing what we need them to do. Beyond the organisations, though, one of the things that really excites us as an organisation is the voices of young people. I've left some of these over here if you haven't picked one of these up already, but we actually spoke to 1,000 young people from low-income backgrounds to ask them really about what they need. What are they telling us is important to them when it comes to having a thriving community? And of course, from a sports charity's perspective, this is absolutely about working out what we can do to narrow the sporting inequalities that exist, and importantly for us to pass on the learning to all of you, to many other rooms about what young people from the poorest backgrounds are saying, but also to help community organisations recognise the different factors that impact upon young people and whether or not they get involved in playing. Because it's not just about what they think about sport, it's about all the other things that go on in their lives. It's about the things they're worried about. It's about the people they consider role models. It's about the challenges they can see around them that prevent them from getting involved in sport. And you won't be surprised, any of you that are around 11 to 25-year-olds, that the top 5, 6, 7 things that they told us they spend their time on had nothing to do with sport whatsoever. So starting with TV and Netflix and music and gaming, and interestingly, where 51% talk about spending time with friends. So there are opportunities in what young people are telling us that point us toward the kind of sport and physical activity they'll be looking for in their community. When we asked them what they're worried about, the top thing was their own and their families' issues around the cost of living. Now, if that is so dominating your landscape as a 12-year-old child, there is no way you can think about asking your mum or your dad or whoever your carer is for some money to go for a swim or to go to football. So being aware of the things that they're worried about and understanding the things that they're worried about are really important. But the brilliant thing within this is that 75% of them want to do more sport. So only 25% of them are doing sport at the moment. 75% of them want to do more. 72% of them really enjoy it. And nearly 70% of them say they feel more confident when they take part. And unsurprisingly, young people know what the benefits are of being active. And the top one from their point of view is the thing that we often forget to talk about, having fun and having a laugh. That is their number one priority for being involved in sport and physical activity. Not working on their right foot for crossing the ball, not trying to strike a ball really well with a hockey stick, absolutely about fun and having a laugh. And holding on to that for us feels really important. I'm just going to finish with a few more points because I realise I'm getting to the end of what I wanted to share. One of the things we did last year was we actually got young people to develop their own version of our theory of change. We're very lucky. We've got someone called Ali in our team who's a brilliant artist, and she spent a couple of days with young people on a residential. And their perspective on how they want things to change is really, really important, and their perspective on how they see their community is really important. So the quote that's up there, you may not be able to read it, says, "Where we live is different, but we all share a love for our community." Those of you who saw the Freddie Flintoff set of documentaries with the young people who got involved in the cricket with him up in, I think it was Preston, they were fierce about the fact they don't live in a deprived area. It's not deprived? What do you mean it's deprived? It's a bit different, but it's not deprived. We pour the data onto bits of paper to talk about how deprived they are. Young people tell us they love where they live. They want to see more happening for them. They want to do more. They want to develop their CVs and be successful later in life, but they don't see what we see when we look at what's on paper. And from our point of view, this is our organisational theory of change. And one of the things for me about this, again, we'll be sharing the slides and you can have a closer look, but we play a role as StreetGames, the national organisation, which is about what we call enabling activities. So helping local community organisations with their connections and partnerships, being advocates for them, helping them with fundraising, providing training for their workforce. And then the activities are provided by the people who do the hard work in the communities every Friday night in the pouring rain on the games area. But I think as a sector, regardless of whether that's StreetGames or any other major national organisation, this is the way towards changing the way that communities behave around physical activity. An enabling role from those of us who are in that position, which is all about supporting those who deliver the front line of activities towards the changes that we want to see. And our end game, you'll all have your strategies and you'll all have your visions. Our end game is to make sure that all young people from the communities we care about can engage in what we call doorstep sport. We only call it that because it happens around the corner. We could call it something else, but we've been calling it that for a while now, so we're not likely to change. We want them to have access to sport and physical activity year round, so it's not something that they only get when it's seasonal, that they can play all the time. We can afford to take our children to different sports at different points in the year. Why shouldn't they have the same offer? We want all young people to have the opportunity not just to be sports leaders, but to become the volunteers and future leaders in their community. The young people we work with, you work with, I'm sure, are amazing. They have better ideas than we do a lot of the time. We need to support them. And we want to work right across the sector as an organisation with all kinds of mainstream sports providers, governing bodies, leisure providers, to help them really get to grips with what those 1,000 young voices are saying and how we can amend the way that we offer traditional sport to reach the young people who need it most. Now, what's clear is we can't do that on our own. And all of us will have something in our strategies that looks a bit like this, because ultimately we all want more people to play and be active. But we need, if we're going to support communities, empower communities, we need to work together. Because if we do get it right, then what we know is that at community level, community sports organisations, be they clubs, youth clubs, housing groups, whatever they are, they connect up policy at a local level. They join up the bit that Kim was talking about. We can't get government departments to talk to each other, but every community organisation we've ever worked with works with the police, they work with the school, they work with all the different bits of government. They join up government at a neighbourhood level. From the Charles Webster Batson Commission, safe places to play, somewhere to go, something to do, someone to trust. So simple. But actually some of that we've forgotten to hold on to. And then the final point for me, I am regularly upstaged by young people being on platforms like this, before me, because they come up and their voices are so much more powerful than mine. But we all collectively, if we're going to change what's happening in communities, we need to listen, we need to learn, and we need to act, and we need to do it in a genuine way, because surely this is the perfect antidote to all of those challenges that exist in our communities right now. Thank you.